Doesn't seem to be possible.
Welcome to the latest program of the OPC's Book Night series. I am Patricia Cranz, the Executive Director. Tonight we will listen to Barbara Demick discuss her book, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, with Ed Wong. As tens of thousands of families with adopted children from China turn to DNA testing, new connections are emerging among the 160,000 Chinese adoptees worldwide, upending what many of them thought they knew about their origins. In following one family's journey through loss and rediscovery, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove illuminates the collective trail of those still searching for the truth of where they come from and who they are. Barbara Demick is a prize-winning author and foreign correspondent. Previous books include Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in a Tibetan Town, and Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea. She was bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times in Beijing and Seoul, and previously reported from the Middle East and the Balkans for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ed Wong has reported for the New York Times for 25 years, working for 13 of those as a correspondent and bureau chief from China and Iraq. His family memoir, At the Edge of Empire, an epic story of modern China, was published in 2024. If any audience members are in NYC, he will be speaking out the book this Wednesday at 6 p.m. at the Museum of Chinese in America in downtown Manhattan. Details are on their website and in the chat. We've also listed links to buy the books in the chat, as well as a link to a past OPC program where Ed discussed his memoir. Please put your questions in the chat as well, and Barbara and Ed will get to them in the second half of the program. So let's begin the conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for that amazing introduction, Patricia. It's very generous of you. I'm glad to be here with Barbara, a close friend of mine. We first met when we were both reporting in China. I was always in awe of Barbara's reporting, the fact that she managed to get out into the provinces, reporting on what was happening with ordinary people across different parts of the country, including in very rural areas. And so I think the story that we're about to hear tonight is very much rooted in that tradition of reporting. And early on in my tenure in Beijing, I started noticing these stories on adoption that Barbara was doing for the LA Times. And she did several that had a huge impact. But the story that she recounts in this book, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, is singular even by the standards of the stellar reporting she was doing in this issue. So I wanted to ask Barbara first if she could maybe provide a little bit of context about why she started doing reporting on adoptions from China, adoptions of young children overseas, and then how she came across this particular story.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you for your kind words. I was always interested in Chinese adoption. I have a very good friend who adopted in China in 2002, and I actually went to China when she picked up her daughter, and I was always very curious, and I've got to say a little bit suspicious about the narrative that all these girls were thrown away. The prevailing story was that Chinese wanted boys. This is true, and that their girls were, tossed away like kittens. And without having been in China very long, I found it hard to believe that healthy human babies were discarded so casually. China has a great recycling culture, one of the things that I love. Um, so, it was always on my mind, and this goes back to 2008, and Ed can talk about this. It was a curiously open period in China, um, ahead of the 2008 Summer Olympics.
Mm.
The Chinese government lifted some of the requirements that we get advance permission to travel around the country. So we just went, we were just going all over the place. And at the same time, it was the early days of social media. I think a lot of the Chinese were using QQ. Weibo was starting around then. Is that right? And
Yeah.
we were
Well,
picking up,
before WeChat, the days
yeah,
of WeChat, which is
yeah,
now,
yeah.
you know.
We were picking up reports from these remote villages that you would never have heard anything from in the past, that that babies were being taken. And I don't know. I mean, I think this is a very China heavy audience, but this was the area of the one child policy. um, most families weren't allowed to have more than one child. And the punishments were very, very harsh, a year's salary, several years' salary worth of fines, homes were demolished, farm animals were taken. And, we were getting reports that babies were taken too.
Yeah. And so you started making trips down to mostly central and southern China, if I recall. And then in Hunan province, you came across this one family. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first heard about this family?
Sure, sure. I'm gonna show some photos now. So just bear with me. I hope that everything works. Okay, let's see. View slideshow. Okay. Okay. Is everybody seeing a map?
All right. And there's Hunan right there,
Yeah,
right in
there's Hunan, and actually, I'm going to start in Guizhou. This area, sort of south central China, was where most of the adopted kids came from, and these were rural, very, very poor areas, um, and this is just a propaganda poster. I mean, the one child policy was the state policy. There were more people working for what was euphemistically called family planning than in the People's Liberation Army. I mean, they were just, doing this policy, with a vengeance. All the resources were directed at it. And this is one of the first families I interviewed. They were in Guizhou, and I don't know if you can tell from the photo, but they were extremely, extremely poor. This was a village that we had to hike up a goat path to get to. And they had, as you can see, three girls. The father had had a vasectomy, but after he had the vasectomy, he realized that his wife was already pregnant, and their baby daughter was taken away. That these officials from family planning used to come to the village, and like they'd look around for, you can see clothesline here, for diapers. No, no, no disposable diapers here, rags hanging on the clotheslines, baby clothes. And this was a really, really remote village, which I think was part of the point, is that most of the adults were illiterate and easily taken advantage of. And then after this family, I moved to Hunan province. And the tall guy in the striped shirt standing under the Mao portrait. And I'm showing you these so you get a sense of how poor these families were. The guy who's standing up, his name um, is Lee, and he had a daughter who was taken away. She was his firstborn child, um, but his wife was from another province and they hadn't registered the marriage. And this is something not well understood about the one-child policy. It's not just one child. You have to have a registered marriage, which, many people would just have a ceremony in the countryside. Um, but this guy, it was his firstborn child. He had gone to, after the baby was born, this was very typical. He had gone to do migrant work um, in the city to raise some cash for the child. And the family planning officials tricked his father who was almost blind, into taking the baby. And this is going to explain soon how I found out about this story. This guy, Lee, who is not well educated, was very smart and very proactive. And he organized a petition drive. Petitioning is a Chinese custom of petitioning to the emperor or to the Communist Party powers that be for relief. And he organized a group of villagers whose kids were taken to write up a petition saying, our children were taken, bring back our children, where are our children? They had no idea at that time where the children were. And, as you might surmise from this document, this is the last page. Many of these parents were illiterate or semi-literate. So under the law in China, actually, this was trying to comply with international law. Before a baby could be put up for adoption, they had to put an ad in the newspaper saying looking for family. But these were always in, obscure legal ads, legal newspapers, something that people in the village would never see, even if they were reading newspapers. Now we're getting to the village where I found these girls. This is all 2009. I went to a village called Gaofeng in Hunan, and I had heard that there was, at this point, I had interviewed many families, but I had heard that in this village, there was a family who had twins, and that one twin was taken away. This is the route into the village. All of these villages were like this. They were very remote and hard to reach. And again, this was kind of by design. These people were sort of cut off from the legal system, and they thought from journalists.
Can you tell us a little bit about how firmly embedded the family planning committees are? Like, does each village have some official who's a member of it? Or are they in nearby villages? How?
The main family planning officials were in the township, nearby town, but everybody in the village was who was an official, was deputized to enforce this family planning. I mean, this was the state policy, and they took this really, really, really seriously. And if there were too many babies born in a village, every official, every civil servant would have their pay docked and would be ineligible for promotion. So there was a lot of incentive for people to squeal on their neighbors. And there was just such great propaganda accompanying this. I mean, China was going to get rich if they kept down the population. This was, if you abide by this, your income is going to go up, your children are going to be well educated, or your single child. People believed, actually, even this family believed, they believed in the policy. They didn't follow the policy, but they believed in it. They were and are, very loyal Chinese citizens. So this is the birth mom, Zanhua. She's in the bamboo grove where her twins were born. It's kind of coincidence that she's holding up two pomelos, but this was like, I guess, a fairly typical young couple. They got married, had a baby. First baby was a girl. the law allowed some rural families whose first child was a girl to have a second. They were supposed to wait. They didn't. They had a girl. And so actually they were kind of happy with their two girls, but the paternal grandfather was like, you got to have a boy, you got to have a boy. And so they really pressured Zhenhua to get pregnant again. And she was, sure she was going to have a boy this time. She was very big in her pregnancy. And she gave birth secretly in a bamboo grove. They had a little hut there. That's where you get the daughters of the bamboo grove. And lo and behold, I guess they had twins. Um, and this could have been a disaster, but actually they're an interesting family. And the birth father was kind of pleased with the twins. He felt like it was kind of a rebuke to his father, who was so insistent. And he's a lovely man. His name is Song, and he I mean, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink, he's very soft spoken, and he kind of, I say in the book that if he had lived in a different society, he might have been a stay-at-home dad. He just loved taking care of his daughters. And so anyway, I went into the village. He wasn't there at the time. They were living in, what was like a log cabin, and the mother and the daughter spoke to me. I don't know if you're going to get the sound on this.
什么？姐姐早一点回来陪我玩耍。姐姐早点回来陪我玩。Sister comes like sooner to play with me.
Yeah, the little girl is talking about how her twin was taken away and how she missed her twin. Actually, she didn't really know her twin. This was after they had these twins, they tried to hide them, and they had all sorts of kind of silly ruses. But one of them was they separated them, and they left one twin with an aunt and an uncle in the same village. And that's the girl who was stolen. Her name was Fang Fang, and she was pretty old when she was taken. She was close to 2 years old. She could walk, she could talk. Actually, the walking might have been part of the problem because she liked to wander around. She was very precocious, and she was taken in a very violent home invasion. A group of men, about 10 of them, burst into the house where she was with her aunt. They were alone, and they immobilized the aunt, and they took Fang Fang was her name, and the aunt tried to run after them. Actually, the whole village tried to run after them, but they had a car and they got away. Anyway, these people were very nice. They said to me, the mom said, come back sometime. I'll make you a meal, bring our daughter. And I was like, yeah, maybe.
They made you promise to get their daughter back, the other twin back for them.
There was it was not a promise I was going to make, but I did tell them I would try. And, it was interesting because
let me ask where did they think the other twin had ended up at this point? Like what was their idea of like where that other twin might have been?
they really had no idea. And, this is a funny thing is at this point, this is 2009, and Chinese adoption was very well known in the US. I mean, especially in New York. It seemed like, a lot of people I knew had adopted girls from China. They were, kind of the perfect adoptees. They were healthy. Their moms didn't smoke or drink generally. A lot of people wanted to adopt Chinese baby girls, but adoption, it wasn't like a secret exactly in China, but it was not publicized. So there were all sorts of theories, and one of them was that the babies were being trafficked for organ donation. And I mean, that might seem crazy, but no rumor was more ridiculous than any other rumor. It's that the baby would be in the US would be, equally implausible. But I mean, I had a pretty good idea of where this baby had gone because this one orphanage in a nearby city, Shaoyang, which is I guess a second tier city in Hunan, um, had adopted out a lot of kids. These orphanages were part of social welfare institutes. They were run by the government, but they weren't very well funded. And when a child was adopted, even though most of the money went through Beijing, and I never found any corruption on the Beijing end of it. Um, the adoptive families were required to make a donation of um, $3,000 cash, $100 bills. You brought it when you went to China. They came to China to adopt and turn it over. At one point, it went up to 5,000, and this was, a lot of money. This was a lot of money. It was a lot of money for anybody. It was a lot of money in rural China. And that money was, kind of running things. It was running these social welfare institutes. I mean, some of it was obviously pilfered, but most of it was, just going to run the show and fund family planning. So it became, had become a business. So I went back to Beijing, to my office in Beijing after this trip. I wrote a series of stories. I wrote a story about how parents said their babies were taken for adoption. And I had what we call a sidebar. I don't know how many of you are journalists, but a short thing about this little girl. It's kind of like a sob story. This little 9-year-old girl wants her twin back, blah, blah, blah. She wants to play with her. That was from the little video I'd made. And I started to kind of look around on social media to see if I could find this adoptee. And this sounds impossible, but this is 2009 and social media was very open and much, people weren't as careful. And these adoptive parents were really proud of their girls, and there were a lot of photos of adoptive kids on social media, actually mostly on Yahoo at that time, because there were different orphanage groups of adoptive parents, were supporting the orphanages, sending money and clothes, and they had organized themselves in these groups in Yahoo. And so I had a pretty good sense of which orphanage had handled her. And I also knew what she looked like. I mean, to me, babies kind of look the same, but I had met her 9-year-old twin. And although the family didn't know, I was pretty sure they were identical. And, and she was taken when she was older. So I started reading things from this orphanage in Shaoyang, and I found one family who had, I don't have the whole thing up here, but there was one family. They were in Texas. They were evangelical Christians, and they had actually started a little fund called Adopt the World to help people adopt. And they wrote about how they had adopted this little girl in December 2002. She was taken in like May of 2002. And they had posted some photos of her, and this was one of the photos. This is what she looked like when she was adoptive. And there's some other, there were actually 2 photos of her online. And so, having read a lot of police procedurals, I made kind of these like spreadsheets of Chinese baby girls. The others were just pictures I had picked out randomly on the internet. But they had, and I sent the pictures of the family with a very sort of vague note. Oh, these are maybe, adoptees from this area, maybe you recognize somebody. No, this thing didn't come out in full, but anyway, they immediately wrote back to me and they had identified the 2 correct pictures. This was this one, and I go back here, and the other one is down here. So I was pretty sure I had the right kid, and I mean, this is where I feel kind of guilty because I hadn't really thought through the consequences of this. I had set up this challenge for myself, and I I realized immediately that, this girl in Texas whose name was Esther, Fong Fong was Esther, was 9 years old, and I couldn't out a 9-year-old girl as being a stolen child. And, meanwhile, the adoptive family had written to me through intermediaries saying, like, please don't write anything. We can't cope with it right now. The adoptive father had died the year before. There were actually two girls adopted from China. And
The mother is named Marcia, is that right?
the mother's named Marcia, and she had adopted. It was her second marriage. I think her husband's third. They both had adult children, and yeah, they had adopted one and then adopted another. They were living in a very rural part of Texas, and I just, what could I do? I took the material I had, the photos, and I had some videos, and I sent them again through an intermediary to them. And I said, I'm not going to write anything, but here's what I found out. And I contacted the family in China, and I said, I think she's safely and, with a good home. And I didn't tell them that the adoptive father had died, but I just don't think you can contact her right now. But she's alive and seems to be well. And, you know, and that's it. End of story.
Well,
So,
end of story. This only covers a fraction of what you
yeah.
narrative you tell in the book. But can you describe to us how later on, of course, when you interview Marcia in depth, you learn about how she felt when she got the initial messages from you that you had sort of stumbled onto the fact that that she had adopted this twin girl from China. You knew the backstory of the girl. How does she, like, what were the circumstances under which she received your message, and how does she feel at that time?
Well, Marcia, the adoptive mom, was just in a panic. And, she already had kids. She didn't adopt because she was infertile and childless. She adopted because she wanted to save the abandoned babies. She had read about, um, girls being one girl who had been thrown in a well. And there was a lot of, some of it true, but there was a lot of anti-China propaganda about abandoned babies. And, she just wanted to save them. She's very religious. She had wanted to be a missionary when she was young, very compassionate, a compassionate conservative. Um, and she was horrified. She felt like it was her own, arrogance that she had, unwittingly contributed to this child being taken. And that comes into play later when they decide they want to talk to me. Um, and it was very difficult for the family, I'll say that. And I talked much later to Esther about it, and she was horrified too. She found out pretty quickly. Her mother tried to keep it a secret, but she was a smart little girl and read her mother's emails. And she thought she was going to be, taken and dragged back to China. She became very say paranoid, well, maybe rightfully worried. She was afraid to go out, and it caused a lot of trauma to the family. Um, this was all 2009. And in 2017, I got a message on Facebook. Um, a lot of this story is about social media. I got a message on Facebook from Marcia's adult son, who is a car dealer, car salesman in Michigan. And it was a very short message saying, you had contacted me long ago about my sister. Are you still interested? That's all it said. And I was like, huh? Who? What? Who are you? I mean, I hadn't
this
been
is 8 years later, which is kind of
It was
amazing.
8 years later. It
Yeah.
was right after the first Trump inauguration. I was very busy. I was living in New York. I was covering some of the drama, and he wrote back to me and he got me in touch with Marcia. And I mean, the gist of it was this girl, now named Esther, was a teenager and she wanted to meet her twin sister, and I could help. Could I help? And it was, this was very strange because they sort of trusted me because I had kept the secret for all these years. I mean, I had no choice. I'd never considered writing about it while she was a child. But they asked for my help, and I got them in touch through WeChat at this point. Esther was afraid to use WeChat. She was still very, very frightened of being, caught by the Chinese and taken back. And so she wrote a letter by hand, and I translated it and scanned it, translated it, and sent it to Shuangjie, her twin. The girls were then 16, actually just short of their 17th birthdays. And Shuangjie was working as an intern in a kindergarten in Changsha, the capital of Hunan province. And they started this pen pal relationship. And I had some of the letters, but I thought it was too invasive to put them up. But, it was like, what's your favorite color? What do you do for fun? And I was going to China for something else, and I decided I would set up a video call on WeChat. And the girls both liked that idea. And this is, anyway, this is Shuangjie. That's my MacBook. We're in a hotel, nice hotel in Changsha. And we started this series of video calls. And you have to read the book on this. Some of it was very funny. There was all sorts of weird cultural off things. They didn't know what time it was for each other. Esther had sent some gifts through me, but Shuangjie didn't want to open them in front of her, which is also Chinese. There was a lot of cultural misunderstandings, but it really broke the ice. And then I did take a swab DNA test, and then I went to see Zhang, the father, and he was just, I was very apologetic for not having done anything earlier, but he was really, really nice and really gracious. And I just love this picture. This is him looking at a picture of his daughter on the computer. That's the midwife also who delivered the twins, also looking. It was very funny in the village because everybody was like very excited about this, and they were looking at the pictures of Esther saying, no, is that Fang Fang? Fang Fang was her Chinese name. Is that Fang Fang or Shuangjie? No, that's Shuangjie wearing makeup. Esther wore more makeup than Shuangjie. And, I realized even without the DNA test, they were twins. And I brought the the pictures back from the village. I showed Esther the picture of her father looking at her, and then I had a picture of her looking at her father looking at her, and it was just, they were like, we want to go to China, can you help? And at that point I said, I can help, but I want to write. And it's because they had no money, and we would have to raise money. I would have to help them raise money. And I mean, at this point, up to that point, I had really just been helping them because I felt bad. But it all came together very quickly, and we went. This is the family, by the way, in Texas. This is the little girl in the pink is Fang Fang, Esther, an older sister. This is what they had been told. You know, Xiao Fuchen, female born on June 8th, 2000, was found abandoned at the gate of Xiaotou Bamboo Craft Factory. We cannot find her natural parents and relatives up to now. They always get a certificate of abandonment. It was all fake. The orphanages gave them a new name. Esther loved Chinese food and actually cooks very well. And here she is, having made dumplings in her house in it's near Fort Worth, and that's Marcia. So it all came together actually pretty easily.
Let me, one quick question. At what point did you explicitly tell Marcia and Esther that she had been stolen from the birth family and not abandoned by the birth family?
They knew that immediately because she was in this series of stories about babies who had been taken, and it was, so it was known right away. And, you would have thought that would have made her feel better that she hadn't been abandoned, but actually it made her feel worse because she felt like she should go back. And, also for Marcia, who had thought she had was, doing this great deed by adopting Esther, there were people who were saying, you need to give her back, you need to send her back. And it was very difficult. Anyway, we got ourselves together pretty quickly. It's funny, after all of that, it was just, I saw, I went to Texas, I saw them. I said, if you let me write, I'll help you raise the money. The LA Times, which I was working for then, paid for the car and the interpreter. And, anyway, we raised the money for their flights. It was not that expensive. And we did it over Lunar New Year because, that's the time you do these things. And this is kind of like the first meeting. And then it's Shuangjia. This is the other girl, Marcia. And this was this like funny thing. I felt like they were like a bride and groom at an arranged marriage. It took a really long time before they would actually look at each other. You can see the family. This is a rice growing family. It's winter, so those are the rice paddies in the background. And they just, there was like a long time they just wouldn't talk to each other. We had a lot of meals, really good food. You could see the two twins. Shuangjia is wearing a sort of a white fuzzy thing. Esther is in black with her hair down. And Esther had begun a career as a photographer, and she's an extremely talented photographer. And so she showed her camera to Shuangjia. The girls are, I guess, 18 now. This was the aunt who told the story about how baby Fang Fang was taken away. And it was very nice. There's the mom in red. She took all her daughters and we walked down to the bamboo grove where the twins were born. It's a group photo. I'm sort of in the back with the orange scarf. This is the orphanage. It was a very poor, rundown, old-fashioned institution at the time of the adoption. They made a lot of money through adoption, and the whole place looked like really looked like a luxury hotel.
So let's rest on the orphanage for a minute, because was it a big decision to decide to go to the orphanage with the families, and then describe a little bit like your interaction with the people at the orphanage once?
Oh, this was actually very funny. You might remember this. So we were in Hunan for a couple of days. We weren't staying in the village because the house wasn't heated, and the bathroom would not have been up to the standards of Marcia, the adoptive mom, who wasn't used to such things. But this was sort of towards the end of the visit to the village, and we hadn't wanted to go to the orphanage because we were afraid that we might get detained. As Ed, you know this, you can get detained in China for all sorts of reasons. And while this was not as sensitive a story as some other things I had written, I knew that reporters who had tried to follow this business about the stolen children, had problems. There was a documentary, One Child Nation, that I was actually supposed to be in, that the filmmakers had a lot of difficulty. So we decided finally to go, and we walked in. It was like it was like the whole group of us, and it was not that well guarded, and they were just aghast that we walked in, and I really thought we were going to get detained. Um, they were like, people. I knew that people had visited the orphanages before, that they do allow adoptees to visit, but it's um, sorry, there's some noise going on here. It's not, it has to be arranged by Beijing and all of that stuff. And the, when we got in, they asked what Esther's orphanage name was. And and then I realized that if we told them, they would know that she was one of the stolen kids. I mean, it turned into a pretty big scandal. And Marcia was like really, really clever and played the Southern Belle, and was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't make an appointment. Next time she did the whole 9 yards, and it worked beautifully. She was like, I thought she would have been a much better foreign correspondent than me. And we sort of skedaddled out of there. So that was the orphanage. We were not there very long. The girls hung out a bit in Changsha. We drove back to Changsha again, the capital, and the here they actually had switched clothing with each other, and it was interesting because they looked very different when you saw them without makeup and in their own clothes, but when they wore makeup, you could see that it was really cosmetic and cultural differences between them. They looked so much the same. And I really love this story. This story ran in the New York Times in 2018. And this is like a very important thing about what I want to say about this. With these adoptees, there's been this assumption that they're so lucky. They're so lucky to have been adopted, and many of them are. Many of them, escaped very poor villages, but not entirely. And when I did this visit, I thought that actually the Chinese family might have been wealthier than the adoptive family, because they had China had changed so much from 2002, when the girl was taken, to 2019, that they were living in this big house. All the members of the family were working, and so this story ran in the New York Times right before the trip, and it says, imagine you have to make a bet. There are two 18-year-olds, one in China, the other in the United States. both poor and short on prospects. You have to pick the one with the better chance of upward mobility. This story, which ran just a few months before our trip, the girls were 18 at the time, concluded that China had much more opportunities for advancement. And this was kind of true at the time. Shuangjia, was on a career path, working she hadn't gone to university, but she had gone to a teaching school, and she was on her way to a career. Whereas Esther, who had been homeschooled, had really seemed to have very little career prospects at the time. This is the house in China that they had built. If you remember, the earlier photo showed kind of a log cabin. So anyway, I mean, this is pretty much the end. Things changed a lot. That was my impression at the time of the reunion, which was 2019, after COVID, or during the COVID lockdown. Shuangjia lost her job, and then a lot of the private kindergartens were closed for good by Xi Jinping, who does not approve of private education. And in the meantime, Esther, who's very entrepreneurial, has had really an excellent self-made career as a wedding photographer and is really doing very well.
Right.
So, hard to say. She inherited that kind of Texas can-do attitude. I don't know. It's are they the lucky girls? Adoptees do not like being told that they are the lucky girls. That's like, don't say that.
And Barbara, one of the people in the audience, they have a question that sort of takes us a little bit further in the timeline here. They want to know if the girls have met in person in the U.S. Has Shuangjia made a trip to the U.S. and has she experienced life in the U.S. with Esther or Fang Fang?
No, and that might have happened if not for COVID, because we had talked about that at the time of the trip, and but everything shut down in early 2020 and didn't reopen until 23, and now it's become just impossible. I mean, it would be very almost impossible for her to get a visa to the US under the current political climate, and probably not so easy for her to get a passport, which she doesn't have.
Right.
So everything kind of stalled during COVID.
Yeah, I think there might be an opening right now for this to happen because Trump, and with the Trump-Xi meeting coming up next year, I think there's actually like a warming or stability in relations right now. And Trump has said that he wants many Chinese students to come to the US. So
Yeah, possible,
you could
but
set
we
it up.
we definitely lost the momentum because we had planned to do it in 2020.
Right. And another, Nicole asks in the chat whether you've gotten adverse reactions to the book or to reporting on adoptees from families that have adopted Chinese children, because they might not want to be confronted with the notion that their kid, their adopted kid, was, stolen, or came from some dark history in China. So it's just they're wondering whether you've had sort of negative, there's been negative reaction to your book and your articles.
Actually, I would have expected more than I got. And I think, if you read the book, it's pretty forgiving actually, there's nothing to forgive of the adoptive families. I mean, many of the people who adopted from China thought that this was the most ethical of international adoptions. The scandals had not come out till much later. And something that I should mention is that these kids who were taken, are not the majority. Somebody who was advising me thought that maybe 10% were taken, and they were taken really after 2000. And this was, we all heard about supply chain problems during COVID, but this was supply chain. There was an enormous demand for um, healthy adoptable babies. And at that time, China was getting much wealthier, and Chinese families were just not willing to give up their daughters. And the system was dependent on this money from the adoptive parents. And that's really why the babies were taken. They needed this money coming in. But the other thing I want to say is I think that this narrative of, girls thrown away, discarded, has been very damaging to adoptees. And I try, rather than to use abandoned, relinquished, because I think the vast majority of girls, were relinquished by their families. They weren't taken, but I don't think they would have been relinquished without the pressures of the one-child policy.
Right. And the way that the family planning officials enacted that policy, right, in very coercive ways.
Exactly. I mean, maybe some, really did not want another girl, but I think they would have, a very, very few would have been abandoned.
And at this point, at some point in these intervening years, the practice of adopting from China sort of ends, right? Like from international adoptions from China, it's almost unheard of now, right? There's the
It's been completely stopped. And even after these stories came out in 2009, and I'll say, something else I'd want to add here is there were a lot of Chinese journalists who were working on these stories. I mean, I got credit for breaking the story along with a couple of other American journalists. But the Chinese journalists knew about this, and a lot of them were tracking it, but they weren't allowed to write. But after my stories came out, it was officially a scandal, and so it did get a lot of attention. It was a cover story in Session, and it adoptions really fell off after that, 2009, 2010. But also they were just running out of children.
Right. And they've ended the one-child policy because of that now.
They've done, yeah, and I mean, just it's really pretty hysterical because the family planning officials who used to take away the babies are now, giving out rice cookers and water bottles and sometimes cash as incentives to have more babies because the population is declining so quickly.
I think it's one of the greatest ironies of contemporary China. So Patricia asks, have the twins stayed in touch?
Sort of. I mean, they send messages to each other on WeChat, but they don't speak the same language. And even with the translation built into WeChat, it's really hard to have much of a relationship. Strangely, Esther stays more in touch with her birth mom, and her birth mom, Zanhua, really has very marginal literacy, but they just send each other's pictures and emojis, and and every New Year's since our reunion, they've had like an online talk.
I'm curious has Esther tried studying Chinese or learning Chinese in order to have better conversations with her family back in China?
She has not, and it's strange, but I've noticed this, that many adoptees, there's a certain trauma associated with their mother tongue, and she hasn't. And it's because she's very smart, but yeah, she was over 2 when she was adopted, and Marcia was told at the orphanage that, oh, she talks a lot and she helps fold the laundry, and she's like, she's very precocious, but the language never came back.
Bill wants to know what your take is on U.S.-China relations right now.
Oh, I think you're the one who, Ed, you're in a better position.
Right.
to-
Well, I mean, like I said, I mean, just very quickly, I don't want to take away from talking about the book. Trump and Xi are seeking some stability in the relationship. They're going to meet in April. They met recently on the sidelines of a summit in Asia. So right now, and Trump's rolling back some of its tariffs. So right now, there's a like almost sort of truce in the trade war. Trump is surrounded by China hawks, people who want to take a much more aggressive position on China, but I think Trump himself is not a China hawk. There's been a huge misperception in recent years about Trump and his take on China. He thinks China screwed the US on trade, but in many other things, he admires China, including Xi Jinping's authoritarian approach to governing. So that's my encapsulation of it. And Caro asked whether there were any repercussions for you personally from the Chinese government during your research and publishing this book.
No, but I haven't applied for a visa to go back to China. So, if I do, I might not, if I do apply, I might not get a visa. I mean, I don't think that my book before this about Tibet was actually much more sensitive. This one, I mean, it has, there's a lot of criticism of corruption in China, but at the same time, there's a lot that it says about Chinese, how Chinese society has advanced, both in its attitudes towards women and, economically. And this family in particular, as I said, is quite, quite pro Communist Party. As they said, it's like, oh yeah, we supported the one-child policy. We just didn't want to follow it.
And I think the one thing that audience members who aren't that familiar with China should know is that many people in China are actually very supportive of the leadership in Beijing. It's not like it's a country that's ripe for revolution or an overthrow of the central leadership. They might be skeptical of local officials, as many people are, for example, family planning officials back in the day, but that in general, they're fairly supportive of the central government and of the leadership of Xi Jinping. Is that right, Barbara?
Yeah, I think so. And this family is a perfect example. As I said, when I saw them in 2009, they were in a log cabin, and now they're in this 3-story house. And they have, as I said, all their kids are working, contributing money, and they have, they have like 4 grandchildren now. I mean, they're very happy. They're really sort of pleased with the advancement in their lives. They were the birth parents were, born sort of, after the Great Leap Forward, but in a period when China was very, very poor. They didn't have, their own clothes. They just had hand-me-down clothes. They never ate meat. They never had eggs. And, their lifestyle has just, improved so much. And these are very ordinary people. They're not, nobody is particularly educated. They're real Lao Baixing, as they're called in China, but their lot in life is much better. And I think because they're not political, they're not intellectual, some of the things we hear from Chinese journalists, artists, academics about, feeling like life has been closed off, don't affect them as much.
Right. And during COVID, the white paper protests that arose to protest Xi Jinping's lockdowns and zero COVID policy were among better educated people in large cities in China, not so much in the rural areas. So
I do think that the job market is slow, and that it's, as here, very difficult for young people to get jobs.
right.
I mean, the economy is not great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. It's a problem in many countries around the world at the moment, like the young people, unemployment among young people. So someone in the chat asked, do you think Esther will go back to China again?
But you've got to read the book. But in one of the last scenes with her, I asked her, "Do you think you're going to go back to China?" And she said, "Oh yeah, of course, but I want to go to Italy first." So, I think I think she got a certain level of peace and resolution by going. but I don't know that she's dying to go back.
Great. Well, and as Barbara just said, we urge everyone to read the book because it's an amazing narrative. And
This is the American edition. Here's the British edition. Very different covers.
great, both are great covers. It's very cinematic and very gripping. So there's, I guess we'll take one more question. I see one popping up here. What are you considering researching next? Good question.
Probably not China, because I don't know that I could do another book like this. I'm actually working on a book about Berlin. So I'm going back to, back to my roots, because my first foreign posting was Berlin. And, it's not as easy to report in China as it was. To be honest, I had very few problems with this book. I'm pretty good at traveling discreetly, but I was never detained or hassled.
In Tibet, you dressed up as a Tibetan woman, if I like in Tibetan robes too, and walked around there, if I remember.
Not exactly, because I didn't, we have this thing, we're not supposed to disguise ourselves, but I wore like a very long coat and a really ugly hat that no
A foreigner would have
wear.
worn. Yeah.
Yeah, so
You
I
were
bring my
you were
hat.
making it seem a bit fuzzy, their
It was
identity.
it was a really weird, a really weird hat. I called it my vanishing hat out of Harry Potter,
Right.
because somehow I just didn't, at worst I looked like a Russian traitor. But I had a lot of misadventures in Tibet. I was, bitten by a dog when I was undercover, and I fell into a sewage ditch in this town that had no water or electricity. I mean, that was much more arduous than this book.
Right.
I mean, this book was arduous too, because it was really remote parts of China. But
Well, that's a good note too. And since we're talking foreign correspondents and other journalists, and it's good to mention that tradecraft that you engaged in. So
yeah,
So thanks to everyone for coming, and you all know Barbara's work, and this book is as compelling as anything she's written in the past. So make sure to get your copy, and when you run to her, she'll sign it for you.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you.